I am going to walk through the final paper for our class. So here we go. I want this paper, I'm going to give you a few different options for this paper. You've written a close reading analysis of one poem for paper one. You've written an analysis and synthesis with two poems for paper two. So at this point, I know you can write a close reading paper of a poem. The final assignment, I'm going to give you a few different options, and I hope you can have some fun with it. All right, here we go. Uh, Introduction to Poetry final paper. Let's have this paper due Friday, May 5th. That's 2 weeks from today. I think that gives us plenty of time. And again, like all the assignments, all the papers, if you're struggling on what to do, what to come up with, please email me and I'd like to talk with you over Zoom about anything. Everything's in Times New Roman, font size 12, double space. Except if you're writing these poems. If you write the poems, you can make those single space. This paper's worth 200 points. This is the big money. For the final paper, you will have two options. You can do a creative assignment, which I'm going to walk through first, or you can do a good old fashioned traditional analysis. For the creative assignment, here are your options. Write 5 to 7 poems using some of the poems we have read this semester as jumping off points. Think of emulating the poems, copying the forms and styles. Think of writing poems from different characters' points of view. You think back to the poems we've read. Casa, Emmett Till's Glass Top Casket. There's a Sylvia Plath poem called Mirror. From objects' points of view, that would be interesting. From a different object's point of view, do whatever you want. Take this wherever you want. I just don't, I don't want any like 30-page epic poems. So if you choose to write 5 to 7 poems, I want you to include 150 to 300 word introduction at the beginning of the whole paper, not for each poem, at the beginning of the whole paper. That just sets up what you're doing, your project themes, what your poems are engaging with, etc., etc. So, I mean, you could write 5 sonnets, you can write 5 shorter poems. Have fun with this. Do whatever you want. Go back and look at what we've done this semester and play around. You can write a 2 to 3 page manifesto. We didn't get a chance to look at too many manifestos. Andre Breton's famous, he has a famous one called Manifesto of Surrealism. A manifesto is a declaration. Think about and answer these questions. And this riffs off what we've done at the beginning of the semester. What to you is poetry? Have your thoughts on poetry changed throughout the semester? What is it supposed to do? What is poetry for? Include references from poems and or essays. We didn't read this book. We read this book in my in-person class. You could ignore this Riccio here. But, what do you think it's supposed to do? What's poetry for? And include some poems though. When if you write this, don't just write poetry's supposed to make you feel. Include some specific poems that reference your thoughts, explorations, and analysis. Another fun thing I like to do in my literature classes and also this class, construct a mixtape or a playlist, as the young ones call it, the playlist that matches songs with some of the poems we have read. Think of, are there poems and is there a soundtrack? And you could take this again wherever you want. This would be like 2 to 3 pages. You might pick 4 poems, a song for each poem. Each poem and song, you could talk about, they would get a paragraph. What comes to my mind, think of Langston Hughes' Song for a Dark Girl. What matches, that's a dark, brutal poem. Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit works really well with that. You could also make it lighthearted, right? Does Earl in Mighty Ponds, does he have the eye of the tiger? Or, have fun with it. And you can use different time periods, different songs. When you do that, analyze, include a line from the poem and a line from the song, and maybe a link to the song as well. 4, I left blank. If any of you are lean toward the fiction side, you might write a 2 to 3 page short story from one of the characters' points of view in the poems we've read. Take the young girl in Tours. Is she a famous concert pianist growing up? Or just go wherever you want with this. So those are a few different options for the creative assignment. If any of you can think of something else, please email me and I'd like to add it to the list. Or you can do a good old-fashioned traditional paper here. For this page, you will write a 2 to 3 page analysis of a poem. You could do a poem or more than one poem that you've not written about. So anything throughout the semester that you haven't written about, you can choose that. You can also write about a poem or poems of your choice as well, something from outside the class. So if you have a favorite poet we haven't covered, you can only cover so much in a short class. Here are just some ideas. Look at confessional poetry. And we have that. I uploaded some stuff about confessional poetry, and I might make a few videos. Where are we? What week are we on here? There's Proofrock. I'm going to make some videos on Proofrock. Where's our... Right here. So here's a bunch of stuff on confessional poetry. These are scholarly articles. You don't have to read those, but there's a reference. There's some John Berryman. So the four runners of confessional poetry: John Berryman, Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath, and Anne Sexton. So I might make a few videos on this. But think about confessional poetry. What's confessional poetry? What are some themes, elements that are prevalent in the poems of Berryman, Plath, Lowell, and Sexton? Confessional poetry it's meant to confess. It was the first time in poetry where individuals put their innermost, darkest, deepest, embarrassing secrets and thoughts in poems. Before that, that wasn't really as much of a thing. How are psychological and emotional turmoil represented in the poems? Look at boredom and or ennui in Berryman's dream songs. Also, what are the speakers struggling with? So you can choose one of these poems, you can choose a couple. Close read 1 to 3 of the happy poems from that section. What defines the particular poems as happy? What to you is a happy poem? When you argue, tie in your poetry choices. Remember, we had Dinosaurs in the Hood, Dennis Smith, the Nikki Walschlager poems, the Major Jackson Mighty Pawns, which I argue is a happy poem, Sean Thomas Doherty's LeBron poems, and there's a bunch of poems from that handout that we didn't read. Rimbaud and Baudelaire, this is getting toward the end here, surrealism and the symbolism. Both Rimbaud and Baudelaire practice a derangement of senses. We're getting into some of my favorite French poets here, in order to construct a new poetry. In what ways do these poems practice these tactics? What lines and images represent a breaking and making new? And right here, Rimbaud, Baudelaire, I'll make a video close reading some of those too. Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird juxtaposes thought and image. In what ways do the images in poem practice a moving throughout? So I think we have that. Is that at the end here? Weekly sessions. Yeah, there we have Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, Ezra Pound's In a Station on the Metro. So those two poems are interacting a little bit, completely different, but fascinating nonetheless. Dickinson, I might make a few videos. We didn't get a chance. There's so many poems and poets that I would have loved to spend whole classes and weeks in the semester on. We just didn't get a chance to do a deep dive. Choose a Dickinson poem and discuss structure, theme, and image. What are some thoughts and elements at work? And there's Dickinson, right? I have a bunch of Dickinson stuff here. Ignore the Miguel Murphy. He's a friend of mine, and his poems are amazing, by the way. But he visited my class last semester or last spring. Look at Lucy Brock Broido's Jessica from the Well. What is the effect of the poet giving Jessica, who is a child, full-blown adult thought and speech? What is Jessica thinking, and how does her thoughts work in relation to her being trapped? Is this a hopeful poem? Why and how so? And this is one of the poems from that happy packet, and it's also attached at the end. Read Constantine Cavafy. C.P. Cavafy's The First Step. I love this poem. How does Theocritus' words help buoy the young poet of Venice? Is this a hopeful poem? Why and how so? Here's what I mentioned at the beginning of this. Choose a poem or poems from outside of class, a poet you might like that we haven't covered. Close read and analyze them. How do they fit into the class themes? What's that speaker? What's the poet hungry for? I like this assignment too. Again, this class predominantly focused on American poetry. Choose a different country. Focus on one or two poets, 1 to 3 poems from that country. That's a fascinating, if you're really interested in love poems. A lot of times we start with American poetry, but choose any country at random. Ireland has some great, every country has some amazing poets. I have some of my French poets up here, but any country has many amazing poems. Choose a poetic movement, and these are just ones off the top of my head. There's tons and tons and tons of poetic movements. The New York School, which we didn't get to, that consists of John Ashbery, James Schuyler, Kenneth Koch, Frank O'Hara, Barbara Guest. Black Mountain School. Language. The Language School was in response to the confessionals. The Language School hated confessional poetry, so that's interesting to look at. There's a more of a recent movement called Flarf, which is really nonsensical poetry, confessional, or post-confessional. BAM, Black Arts Movement, Amiri Baraka, Nikki Giovanni, Gwendolyn Brooks. The Dark Room Collective, another African-American poetry movement that's really wonderful. You could look at some slam poetry movement if you want. Trace the rise and characteristics of the movement. Close read at least 2 to 3 poems. The above mentioned are strictly American movements. However, their influence is vast. You can feel free to choose a movement from another country as well. Futurism, Russian or Italian futurism, surrealism, French, etc., etc. So that's a quick overview of the final paper. As always, you're not limited to these. These are just some of the later poems we're reading that jump out to me. You can write about anything as long as you haven't written about it previously. So if there's a poem earlier in the semester that you want to write about, feel free. If you have a poems you want to write about, analyze, and close read, that's cool. If you want to play around and have some fun writing your own poems, I welcome that as well. Because like I said, you've all already written 2 analysis. So have fun with this last paper. And please email me with any questions.